In the never-ending debate between Chinese New Year and Lunar New Year, we often fail to consider what the local Asian names of the holiday actually are. After all, Chinese New Year is primarily celebrated in Asian countries. So if we want to have an informed opinion on the English name of the holiday, we should first understand what the Asian names are. So, in this video, I will explain what Chinese New Year is actually called in different Asian countries. And by the end of this video, I think you will realize that the debate over the English name is a rather silly one because the correct answer will become quite obvious. Hi, and welcome back to the channel. Today, I'm going to explain the meaning, history, and controversy behind the various names of Chinese New Year around Asia. I'm going to cover the countries of Japan, Korea, Vietnam, and China, because these are the countries of the Sinosphere, which was a group of civilizations that were most influenced by Chinese culture in ancient times. Outside these countries, Chinese New Year is only celebrated by Chinese diaspora populations, like in Singapore, Malaysia, Indonesia, and Thailand. Okay, with that out of the way, let's get started with the country that invented the calendar on which the holiday is based, China. Most Chinese folks will tell you that the holiday is called Spring Festival in China, or Chunjie in Mandarin. And they aren't wrong. That is the modern common name for the holiday. However, it's not really the traditional or formal name for it. The formal name for the first morning of the new year is Yuandan, which just literally means first morning in classical Chinese. I say first morning because there are different names for the first day and first month. But let's keep the name Yuandan in mind because that will be important as we go on. The first country outside of China to adopt a holiday was actually Vietnam. The Vietnamese will tell you that they call the holiday Tet. But that's not actually the full name of the holiday. The full and formal name of the holiday is Tet Nguyen Dan. Now, I don't speak Vietnamese, but I could guess right away what that name means because it's quite literally just the Chinese phrase Jie Yuan Dan, pronounced with a Vietnamese accent. And yes, I know, technically in Chinese it should be Yuan Dan Jie, but that's just because Vietnamese grammar places the noun before the adjective. And here, I should probably explain that all the non-Chinese languages of the Sinosphere incorporate vast amounts of Chinese loanwords. Anywhere from 30 to 60% of the vocabulary in these languages derives from Chinese. It's just like how English takes most of its vocabulary from French, Latin, and Greek. So, Yuandan, that I mentioned 2 minutes ago, when talking about Chinese names for the new year, yeah, that's the same word as Nguyen Dan in Tet Nguyen Dan. You can clearly hear the similarity even if you know neither language. Yuan Dan, Nguyen Dan. But what about the Tet part? Is that really the same as Jie in Mandarin? Yes. The reason why they sound so different is because Tet is derived from an older Chinese pronunciation of the same word. Tet, or Jie, just means festival in both Chinese and Vietnamese. So the Vietnamese name for the holiday is literally just the archaic Chinese name for the same holiday. I mean, why wouldn't it be? Holidays imported from foreign cultures do tend to retain the names of their originating countries. Cinco de Mayo is called Cinco de Mayo even in English. It's not called May 5th, even though that's what it means. The Vietnamese are doing the exact same thing. They're calling a Chinese holiday by its Chinese name. It really shouldn't be surprising. Now let's move on to the next country that adopted Chinese New Year, Korea. And this will be the trickiest one to break down. If you ask any Korean person what Chinese New Year is called in Korean, they will first insist that it's not Chinese New Year, but Lunar New Year, and then proudly tell you that in Korean, it's called Salal, which is a native Korean word with no Chinese influence, further reinforcing their thesis that the holiday is now Korean and no longer Chinese. Well, they're not wrong about the name. Salal is indeed a native Korean word that roughly means new beginning. But there's a small problem. Salal was elevated as the official name for the holiday only in the 20th century. Prior to that, the dominant name for the holiday, as attested in Korean records, was Wangdan or Wangri. Wangdan, as you can probably guess, is just the Korean way of pronouncing the Chinese word Yuandan, and Wangri is just the Chinese word Yuanzhi, which means first day as opposed to first morning. Now, to be fair, Salal does have a long history. The first instance of the name dates to 1481. Ironically, it was in a book written to teach Tang Dynasty Chinese poetry to Korean commoners. The book was written with Hangul, which is the native script of Korea, invented just 30 years prior. Before Hangul, all Korean was written using Chinese characters, and the term Salal never appeared in the historical record prior to that point. Hangul was meant as a means for the peasantry to read and write at a basic level. Thus, the books written in Hangul were all targeted towards the formerly illiterate peasantry of Korea. And in that 1481 book, Salal was mentioned as the translation for New Year in a Chinese poem. After that first instance, the word Salal nearly disappeared from the historical record. There's no exact count, but estimates are that it appeared less than 200 times prior to the 20th century. The Chinese names Wangdan and Wangri, by contrast, appeared tens of thousands of times throughout documented Korean history. It wasn't until the emergence of Korean nationalism in the early 20th century that the name Salal was elevated as the one true name for the holiday, and the Chinese names were erased from common usage and relegated to historical records. This is why modern Koreans all know the holiday as Salal, and only those Koreans with a keen interest in history know that Salal is a relatively recent invention. Going back to the early analogy with Cinco de Mayo, what the Koreans have done here is the equivalent of changing the name to 5th of May. It's still the exact same holiday, but the Mexican roots of it have been obfuscated by changing the original Spanish name to a generic English one. Changing the English name of Chinese New Year to a generic Lunar New Year is doing the exact same thing. It's erasing the Chinese origins of a Chinese holiday. Now let's move on to the last member of the Sinosphere, and also the last country to adopt the Chinese calendar, Japan. Most of you probably know that modern Japan doesn't celebrate Chinese New Year at all. It celebrates its New Year on January 1st, along with the rest of the world. They made this change all the way back in 1872 as part of their Meiji-era westernization efforts. This was how Japan distanced itself from Chinese cultural influence. It just stopped practicing Chinese culture. Unlike Vietnam and Korea, Japan didn't hang on to Chinese culture and just change the name to something non-Chinese. As a Chinese person myself, I much prefer the Japanese approach. They borrowed Chinese culture back when they were big China Maxers, and then returned that culture when they stopped being China Maxers, which is entirely fair play. This is why no one in China has beef with Japan. Well, at least not over this issue. The Chinese only have beef with countries that keep practicing Chinese culture but claim it isn't Chinese. Back when the Japanese did celebrate the Chinese New Year, they called it Shogatsu, which, as you can probably guess by now, is just another Chinese name for the holiday pronounced in the local language. In both Chinese and Japanese, Shogatsu means first month. In Mandarin, it's pronounced 正月. This huge difference in pronunciation is again just due to the Japanese using an archaic Chinese pronunciation for the same word. Nowadays in Japan, the holiday is called Kyu Shogatsu, which just adds the Chinese word for former to the beginning. So it's former first month. The full and formal name for the holiday is actually Chugoku no Kyu Shogatsu, which literally translates to Chinese first month or Chinese New Year. This is why, despite all the bad blood between modern China and modern Japan, there is remarkable harmony when it comes to discussions of pre-modern history. The Japanese, to their great credit, have never tried to obfuscate the Chinese origins of their own culture. And with that, we have the full set of Sinosphere countries. As you can see from everything we discussed, all of them call or called Chinese New Year by its Chinese name. This honestly shouldn't come as a surprise to anyone. Holidays imported from foreign cultures are almost always referred to by their original names, often in their own original languages. The Chinese calendar is one of many lunar solar calendars or lunar calendars around the world. The Persians, Arabs, Hindus, and Jews all have their own calendars, and all of their New Years are called by their native names, even in English. And there's never been any attempt to change those names to something generic like Lunar New Year. In fact, if any holiday could be accurately renamed to Lunar New Year, it would actually be the Arab New Year of Hijri, which is actually based on a purely lunar system and not a lunar solar one. But no one in the Islamic world would ever accept such a name change because it would erase the Arab origins of the holiday. And unlike in the Sinosphere, there's no movement to de-Arabify Muslim culture, even though the majority of Muslims actually aren't Arab. The most populous Muslim country is Indonesia. They celebrate Arab New Year in a completely different way than Arabs in the Middle East. But there are no Indonesians who insist that the English name for the holiday be changed to Lunar New Year to make it more inclusive. In fact, I cannot think of a single other holiday with a distinct national origin that has had its name changed to something generic and stripped of its cultural origins. And I don't think that it's a coincidence that Chinese New Year is being singled out for this kind of cultural erasure, given how the West and some countries in Asia feel about China in the modern age. And I do want to emphasize modern China because it is opinions on modern China that are at the heart of this debate. The countries of the Sinosphere had no issues with borrowing culture from ancient China and calling them by their ancient Chinese names, as we've seen in this video. There was never any effort to obfuscate Chinese origins because having Chinese origins was seen as a point of pride in those days. This all changed during the Century of Humiliation. All of a sudden, China-maxing was no longer all the rage, and the Sinosphere countries did everything they could to distance themselves from that aspect of their history. Japan did it by dropping some aspects of Chinese culture in favor of Western ones, and the Koreans and Vietnamese did it by just rebranding Chinese culture as their own. Anyway, I hope that was at least somewhat educational and brought some new insight into this never-ending debate about what the correct name for Chinese New Year should be. Regardless of what you wish to call the holiday, The one thing all Asians can agree on is that it's the year of the fire horse. And that's cool as hell. So, Happy New Year, the fire horse. And until next time, peace.